Term drop-in refers to a simple change of refrigerant without modification of oil or component. There are no direct drop-in refrigerant substitutes approved for service to replace the R22. Polyester synthetic oil are commonly used in new HFC systems and for retrofitting HCFC equipment to HFC refrigerants. Ester-based oils can be mixed with no other oils. Temperature glide is when a blend of refrigerants has a range of boiling points or condensing points throughout the evaporator and condenser respectively at a constant pressure. This is caused from the blend being a mixture and not a true compound. So let's read that again. Temperature glide is when a blend of refrigerants, so more than one refrigerant, has a range of boiling points or condensing points throughout the evaporator and condenser respectively at the constant pressure. So in other words, you have one refrigerant that say boils at 100 and another that boils at 150. That means you're going to have part of it boiling. When that one comes out at 100, it's going to boil, and then it's not, and then the other at 150 is going to boil. A ternary blend refrigerant is a three-part mixture. So ternary, like the TER, that means three. So just ternary, three, both start with T, is a three-part mixture. A leak trace gas is not a refrigerant as it is used in EPA's refrigerant management regulations. The term retrofit refers to a change to an appliance in order to convert it to a different refrigerant. Venting refrigerant from a recovery machine or recovery cylinder is illegal. Remember, you can't vent it out. You have to keep it in something. All refrigerants that are not exempt from the venting prohibition can only be sold to persons who have successfully passed the EPA's Section 608 certification examination. Refrigeration. In this section of code, we will cover the basic refrigeration cycles in general statements that you should already know as technicians. A common pressure gauge for the low side of the system measures pressure in PSIG and inches of vacuum. Manufacturers often color code the exterior of gauges. The color of the low pressure gauge on the typical gauge manifold is set to blue. The color of the high pressure gauge on the typical gauge manifold is set to red. The range displayed on a high pressure gauge on a service manifold is 0 to 800 PSIGs. The center port on a 3-port manifold set is used to recover, evacuate, and charge a refrigeration system. So the center port on a 3-port manifold set is used to recover, evacuate, and charge a refrigeration system. Page A11. The component that changes a low pressure vapor to a high pressure vapor in the refrigeration system is the compressor. The condenser changes the high pressure vapor to high pressure liquid in the refrigeration system. So it's like when you have condensation on your glass, you have water on the outside of a cold glass, that's condensation. So it's changing, this condenser is actually changing that vapor into a liquid. Refrigerant leaving the condenser coil is in a state of high pressure liquid. Leaving the condenser, the high pressure liquid enters the metering or expansion device of a refrigeration system. In a direct expansion vapor compression refrigeration system, the cooling effect occurs when the liquid refrigerant is vaporized. Returning from the evaporator, the state of the refrigerant is superheated vapor, which goes back into the compressor suction. So it leaves in a high pressure liquid and comes back in a superheated vapor. If increased temperature glide is suspected, there is not a good reason to take an oil sample. An oil sample should be taken if the refrigeration system has had a leak or a major component failure. Finding and repairing leaks in the system will conserve refrigerant when servicing an appliance. When an HFC system with POE oil has been opened for a major system repair, 500 microns is the minimum evacuation level that should be achieved before charging the system. Number 16, refrigerant will migrate to a compressor's crankcase when there is a difference between the oil pressure and the vapor pressure. When there is a dehydration vacuum in the system, you would never operate the hermetic compressors. Flushing with liquid refrigerant to clean field tubing is not a recommended technique of system cleanup after a compressor burnout. R407C refrigerant is likely to experience fractionation. Let's look and see what fractionation is. Fractionation is the process of separating a mixture into its components or fraction. So R407C refrigerant is likely to experience this, but it's likely to break down into the different components like chlorine, fluorine. Page 812, the 3 R's: recover, recycle, reclaim. The first process of the 3 R's in performing a major repair that requires the removal and replacement of the compressor is to recover the refrigerant from the system. When you remove the refrigerant in any condition from the system and store it in an external container without necessarily testing it in any way, this is called recovering. The second process of the 3 R's is recycling the refrigerant. This process applies to cleaning refrigerant for immediate reuse by oil separation and single or multiple passes through devices like replaceable core filter dryers, which reduce moisture and acidity. And the third process of the 3 R's is reclaiming. When you reclaim refrigerant, it means you process refrigerant to a level equal to new product specifications as determined by chemical analysis. An important fact to remember is that under EPA regulations, refrigerant must be reclaimed to a purity level as specified in AHRI 700. Leak detection. As was mentioned earlier, it is assumed that you have a good working knowledge of refrigeration principles and practices, including leak detection techniques. For that reason, this study guide dwells lightly on that subject. As you are well aware, there are several methods and tests that can be used for detecting leaks, not the least of which is the simple soap bubble test. However, the EPA considers the electronic and ultrasonic tester to be the most effective method for locating the general area of a small leak. In terms of protecting the environment, you need to remember that if you are leak testing a newly assembled system or an old system which has lost its complete charge, the EPA recommends dry nitrogen as the gas of choice in order to cause the least damage to the environment. Pressurized nitrogen should be used to leak check a system designed for use with R410A that has been open for a major system repair. Of course, if a system will not hold a vacuum after it has been evacuated, then the system may be leaking. This assumes that the recovery unit and fittings do not have leak. Recovery techniques. All new recovery equipment must have an EPA-approved certification label. If you discover that some R410A refrigerant was added to an R22 system, you should recover the mixture in a separate recovery tank. Page A13. One fact that affects the speed of recovery is the ambient temperature. That means the temperature around the unit. Low ambient temperature increases the recovery time. As a technician, you should avoid using long hoses between the refrigeration system and the recovery machine to avoid excessive pressure drop and increase recovery time. Do not mix different refrigerants in the same container when recovering refrigerants because the mixture may be impossible to reclaim. Only one refrigerant should be recovered in a recovery cylinder. Dehydration. Any amount of moisture or water in a refrigeration system is simply catastrophic and will eventually lead to a major failure and extensive cleaning of the system. It is vital that during all stages of the installation, service, and repair procedure, that moisture is identified and eliminated from the system. Small amounts of moisture will react with the refrigerant and oil and cause it to become acidic. The following statement affects the dehydration time of a system. 1. The brand of micron gauge used during the evacuation process does not affect the speed of evacuation. The ambient temperature and the amount of moisture in the system will affect the speed of system dehydration. For accurate reading during evacuation, the vacuum gauge should be connected to the system and as far away from the vacuum pump as possible. The capacity of a vacuum pump and its suction line size determines the length of dehydration time. Vacuum lines or hoses should be equal to or larger than pump intake connection. The piping connection to the vacuum pump should be as short in length and as large in diameter as possible. The refrigeration system is considered to be dehydrated when the vacuum indicator shows you have reached and held a vacuum of 500 microns or less. If you can heat up the system during dehydration, it will decrease dehydration time. In order for a system to be measured for a final system vacuum, the system should be isolated and the vacuum pump turned off. Page A14. Number 10, over-evacuation of a system will not occur. To dehydrate a system, the system has to be evacuated. The reason for dehydrating a refrigeration system is to remove water and water vapor, which we said earlier was catastrophic. If it had water and water vapor in the system, it would be catastrophic. It would be awful. Technicians can only charge used CFC, HCFC, and HFC refrigerant back into the evacuated appliance or into another appliance owned by the same owner because the used refrigerant may no longer meet AHRI standard for virgin refrigerant. Safety general. As a service technician, you follow many safe work practices during your daily activities. Also, you have seen and studied many rules of safe work practices published by various equipment and refrigerant manufacturers. These are important and need to be followed. You will probably recognize many of these rules as you review the following list of safety rules and safety facts the EPA has highlighted for your special attention as you prepare for the certification test. A recommended safety practice when operating refrigerant recovery or recycling equipment is to remain at least 5 feet away from any operating equipment. Number 2, in the event